how to identify what is that thing that allows me to wake up in the morning and feel like I'm doing what I'm here to do? And then how do I let it out into the world in the context of work? It's the thing that you've known but very often ignored, or either family or society has told you that it's not an appropriate way to invest your energy in the world. It'll never give you what you want, but it's always there. It doesn't change the fact that this is you.
I study the patterns of the universe.
Masters to the brain.
Virtual your mind. Talking about your life, fundamental principles,
philosophy.
What is and what is not true.
those who know themselves.
Being better every single day.
Welcome back to another episode of the Think Grow podcast, where personal development meets real life. I am your host, Ruben Chavez, and on this show, I explore a variety of topics with thought leaders, scientists, artists, psychologists, entrepreneurs, and people from all different walks of life in an effort to bring you different perspectives that you can use to enrich your mind and improve your life in whatever way you see fit. Today, I am talking with someone who I've had on the podcast before, a person who I've had the privilege of calling a friend for the past 4 years or so. His name is Jonathan Fields, and Jonathan is an award-winning author. He is a creator, he's a quintessential maker, and just an all-around really, really good guy. Last time he was on the podcast, we talked about doing meaningful work and things related to that. And this time, we're kind of picking up where we left off, and we're diving deep into a framework that Jonathan created that he was actually working on during our first conversation about a year ago and has now finished it. And this framework is called Sparketypes. It is a methodical and very well thought out system of sorts to help you discover what it is that you're meant to do, the essential nature of the work that most suits you. So instead of haphazardly going about finding what it is that you're supposed to be doing with your life, this system, this framework has been designed to help you discover that through a series of questions. And it's not a superficial questionnaire. What I love about Sparketypes, as he calls it, is that it's actually based in very real and very well-researched psychological principles. It takes into account personality psychology and your temperament and things like that. So it's very comprehensive, and I asked him a bunch of questions about it. He explains it, so I don't want to belabor the point here. But if you are someone who's ever asked yourself, what should I do with my life? And I'm guessing that is probably a good portion of you. I would highly recommend listening to this episode and taking the Sparketype assessment that Jonathan offers for free. The link to that is at the show notes for this episode, which you can find on thinkgrowprosper.com, as you can for all the other show notes for all the other episodes. So that's a little background on what Jonathan and I are discussing. I did not do it justice. Jonathan is a very eloquent speaker and an awesome teacher. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Here's Jonathan Fields. Jonathan Fields, what is going on, man?
Oh, always lots of stuff.
I know we were talking about how busy of a year you've had with your business.
Yeah, I don't know if it's in the air. I mean, I know your life has been massively disrupted because you're dad now, and that like changes everything, like plans go out the window. But I feel like I'm having conversations with so many people these days, and I feel like so many people are going through these windows of really significant change. Have you noticed that also, or is it just the people that I'm talking to?
Significant change. Yeah, no, I mean, I think I have noticed that. I think it's like part of it is something maybe to do with the the climate of the world. Like, I mean, culturally, politically, I think people are just like reaching breaking points or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely part of it because no doubt, I think that is causing just it like the baseline level of anxiety and uncertainty. I think has gone up dramatically for so many people, and I think maybe sometimes when that happens, we kind of re-examine who we are and what how we're spending our time on the planet, and maybe that leads to some reconsideration and some changes. But yeah, I'm definitely feeling like there's kind of a bit of a disruptive energy that I'm just hearing in conversation from a lot of people.
Yeah, hopefully it's leading to productive things. Often it starts as disruptive, but then it leads to kind of more productive and constructive things.
Yeah, creative destruction, right?
So, man, you created this framework that I really want to talk about. That's called Sparketypes, and it's all about how to kind of find what it is that sparks you, find what it is that lights you on fire. And I think it's so interesting because I've been studying it and I've been looking at it, and it maps onto some of these more even well researched personality frameworks that I find quite, and so I find that quite interesting. So I just want to start talking about that. I want to jump right into this. And first of all, why did you start? Why did you make this framework? What led you to create Sparketypes? And in your words, what are Sparketypes? Because I know I kind of mangled the definition there.
It's okay. I'm still working on it myself. I think for so many people like us, and probably so many people who are listening, so much of what we start doing starts out as our own personal curiosity and project, and we're trying to explain ourselves to ourselves, or trying to explain the way we interact with the world to ourselves. And then for me, what I started to realize is I've sort of operated in the world for a long time now, for a couple of decades, through writing, through speaking, through teaching, through facilitating, exploring in some way, shape, or form what people are here to do, and developing process and exercises and experiences. And a lot of people really, what I started to realize over the last couple of years, have been coming to me saying, like, how do I figure out what is my thing? What am I here to do? And then what I realize is, even more specifically, when they're coming to me and asking that question, what they're really asking is, how do I find and do work that allows me to feel like the thing that I'm here to do is being done, and it's being fully expressed on a level where I feel like there's nothing being held back, and I'm being seen and embraced and accepted for doing that thing and being that person. So I started developing a lot of ideas and process over the years, working primarily with founders of companies and entrepreneurs to help them figure out, how do I build a company that serves that purpose for me, where it's not just out there and it's thriving financially and serving a consumer need, but it's also acting as an engine of expression for these critical drivers for me. And then what I realized is that all the stuff that I've been developing in that lens was really much more broadly applicable to just anybody who wanted these answers in the context of work. We spend the vast majority of our waking hours in some way, shape, or form doing work, whether it's the work we get paid for or whether it's the thing we do because that is just the work we've committed ourselves to in the world. And I wanted to explore these deeper questions. And I found that I was being asked to talk a lot about purpose. I was examining the concept of purpose. I was examining the concept of engagement. I was examining expression and the need to feel fully expressed in the world. I mean, there's fascinating data that shows that people will take a substantial cut in pay in order to be able to do work that allows them to feel fully expressed and on purpose. And it just shows how much that matters to people. And there's also data that shows that something like 85% of people in the workforce don't feel that, don't feel anywhere close to that. So there's a lot of pain and suffering around this, like how to identify what is that thing that allows me to wake up in the morning and feel like I'm doing what I'm here to do. And then how do I let it out into the world in the context of work? So I kind of went deep down into that rabbit hole and the way my brain works is I'm all about pattern recognition. And so I devour research. So I had been for years already devouring a lot of academic research in the world of positive psychology. Part of that goes into meaningfulness and purpose and engagement, resilience, things like that. And then also, part of my mind has spent a lot of time traveling in spiritual traditions. And so I started looking at all of these different things. Like, how do you find your sense of driving purpose, your reason for being, your ikigai, from both an academic context, from a spiritual context? What I found was that there is a ton out there in both of those fields, but in the world of academia, very often it's not practical and it's not applied. It's more about mapping and defining what these things are and why they matter. And then in the world of spirituality or metaphysics, there's some really interesting answers, but they're generally all tied to some lineage or some spiritual path or tradition of practices that also very often take a very long time to unfold and are nuanced and not very clear. And I began to wonder, is there a practical, systematic way to be able to walk somebody through a set of questions or prompts that would elicit the drivers of purpose, engagement, and expression on sort of a source code level in a relatively quick and immediate experience so that they could shortcut the process to a certain extent and begin to do more of that in the world a lot faster. So that doesn't mean that it's going to tell you exactly what the shape of that looks like in a really specific way in the world. But what it will do is reveal sort of like on a DNA level, what is the deeper driver? And that driver, once you know it, can be expressed in thousands of jobs, roles, companies, industries. And I found like that was the real unlock key. So my purpose became my research really focused on that. And that led to the development of a set of archetypes that we call Sparketypes, just kind of because it's fun and shorthand. And then spending a lot of time building an assessment that would essentially allow people to understand these things and then start to live into them in the way that they exist in the world. That was a really long-winded answer.
I think you summed it up perfectly, more articulately than I did. I want to touch on a few things. First, I love the idea that it's kind of merging science and spirituality, the mysticism and the rationality. I think those two need to merge, and when they do, they're two sides of the same coin ultimately, because the universe is one thing at the end of the day. So there has to be some kind of reconciliation there, and it sounds like you've integrated that into this approach, which I think is really cool. The other thing is that I love the fact that it's not like saying, and we're going to get into all these different Sparketypes, what the 10 different ones are, and kind of unpack them just a little bit each. But I love the fact that you're not just saying, oh, you're a Maven, you should be a academic, you should be a teacher or something like that. It's much more nuanced than that. It's essentially a set of traits that can manifest themselves in the same profession, even much differently, in different ways. And so I think that's a much more realistic way of looking at it, because ultimately not everyone is going to leave their job. Not everyone can leave their job and just uproot their family and go do something else, follow some whim. Sometimes, and this is where I think this framework is very useful, sometimes you have to figure out how to make your gifts work in the context of what you're doing already. And I think your framework is very useful for that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you keyed in on something I think that's so important, which is when I sit down with my team to develop tools like this and the body of work behind it, the idea is, how do we create resources and solutions that are practical and acknowledge the reality of people's lives in the real world, give them really solid information that they can do something with without a prerequisite being, well, you've got to blow up your life and walk away from everybody who disagrees with you.
Right.
Because it's just not realistic for your average, like if you're 17 years old, if you're 22 years old, that's okay. So you'll do it.
Yeah.
If you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s and you have a family or kids, and you're not going to do that. You're just going to live and suffer and just assume that that's the way it has to be, rather than saying, no, what if you actually could honor a lot of what brought you to this place in life? What if you feel like you could stay with the deep value that you have to provide for support, your family, and be there and provide a certain sense of security, but you understood yourself on a deep enough level that you could then turn around and look at what you're doing, identify what's working really well about it, identify where the conflicts are, and then focus on resolving them without having to blow anything up, because you have a much more nuanced understanding of what you really need, what needs to be present, and how to get it by just putting the work into that. And and that's why I really, the goal was to create tools that provide freedom and not say, you have to go into a process of pain in order to get what you want, to really acknowledge that we need solutions for people in the real world.
Yeah, and ultimately what this is about is really just understanding yourself better, because the better you understand yourself, the more you're going to be able to figure out your life, figure out what it is that you are here to do, and do those things. So I think anything that helps us gain a better understanding of who we are is really useful. And this is one of those things. So real quick, before we get into it, I just for my own benefit and curiosity, you don't have to go into great detail on this, but I'm curious, how did you start gathering, or how did you, start gathering the data that allowed you to build this framework, if that makes sense? What went into that?
A lot. So there's the more traditional, sort of like devouring whatever's available from an academic standpoint. While we started really codifying a lot of this work in the last year, and we built the assessment over pretty much the entirety of 2018. The work that's gone into it has actually, the deeper background has gone on for probably a couple of decades, if I'm being honest. And that's just really deep dive into a lot of the academic side of research on the individual elements that I sort of explore.
Like you were saying, personal positive psychology and things like that.
Positive psych. And there's great research. There's great research on purpose, on meaningfulness, on engagement, on flow states, on things like this. So that's nice in that there is something to really draw upon. And then again, reflecting on spiritual paths, which it's really interesting how you said they all come back to the same human experience. So at some point they have to sync. And what I've come to believe over the years is that in no small way, positive psychology, which is a very academic science-based pursuit, is really largely the science of Buddhism and Eastern thought, because it really maps to so many of the practices that are thousands of years old, derived very often from Buddhist practices. And it's just scientific validation that these things work. So you do find that these paths overlap a lot. So those are part of the explorations. And part of it is I've been fortunate to work with, at this point, probably thousands of people, individuals, business owners, people who are exploring these questions over the years on a personal level, in groups, in large formats, facilitating. It's a matter of field testing all of these ideas, and iterating and iterating and iterating and improving and digesting and distilling. So it's a lot of my own experimentation, my own life experimentation, and field knowledge in just having worked these ideas over and over and over with large numbers of people. Once we started to actually distill them into a set of archetypes, then you keep asking the question and drilling down and running them by other people who are way smarter than me to get their input. And then as we build the assessment, then we start to actually expose the core ideas to increasingly large groups of beta testers. And we're seeing both structurally, is the assessment that we built holding up? Is it confusing? Do we need to refine the logic and the language? And then is it giving valid answers? Like when people get what they get from the assessment, are they turning around and saying, this makes no sense to me? Or are they turning around and saying, wow, for the first time in my life, I actually feel like not only am I seen and understood, but I see and understand myself. This explains so much of what got me to this place. And when we got to a place where that started to happen very consistently, we started to realize that we were ready to begin to turn this out to the world on a larger scale.
That's actually, you mentioned something there at the end that is a key, is that that something is true, or at least is in the direction of truth when, it resonates. Like there's something in there that is familiar and that you recognize it as true, right? So when you get your Sparketype, you're like, oh yeah, duh, like this makes sense. And that's points to something that I think is true. And tell me what you think about this. Do you think that the work that people are meant to do is often like just right under their nose their entire life, and they just haven't really been able to maybe think about it or view it in a way that they see it as work, but it's there all along? And because I think that's the case, and I think what the Sparketypes kind of help people to do, it seems, would be to just kind of illuminate the things that are already right there under their nose that are part of what they're here to do.
Yeah, that's Ruben, that's such a great observation. And that is, we have heard almost that exact same language from so many people at this point. It's the thing that you've known but very often ignored, or either family or society has told you that it's not an appropriate way to invest your energy in the world. It'll never give you what you want. And because they invalidate it, you invalidate that as being your true essential nature, but it's always there. It doesn't change the fact that this is you, and this is that source code for you. But we intentionally forget it. We step away from it. But I agree. It's still right there. You scratch the surface, and with almost everybody, it's there. And we've had so many responses with people who are like, you can feel the tears coming through the emails saying, I've known this to be true my whole life, but I pretended it's not, or I've ignored it because I've been like in some way, shape, or form either felt shame or felt like this shouldn't be. But this has validated what I know to be true, and it's given me permission to start to explore what it would look like to start to bring this into more of my day-to-day existence. And that's completely, what we were trying to do. This is not crazy. Like it's not like you're going to discover something radical and different about yourself. For most people, you do know the answer, but what this is doing is it's prompting you in a way that it takes it from either the subconscious or just underneath the surface from something that was buried, and it makes it apparent, and then it validates it as a valuable way to contribute to your life and to the lives of those around you. And then it allows you then permission to invest yourself in figuring out what does that actually look like on a day-to-day basis.
So powerful, man. I like that a lot. Something I wrote down in my notes was like, if you hate math, if you've hated math your entire life, it's unlikely you're going to wake up one day and realize that you want to be a rocket scientist. Like that's less likely than if you say get lost in stories and read a lot and write down your dreams often and they become elaborate. It's like, oh, well, maybe you're a writer. Maybe you're actually a creative writer. You know what I mean? That's like that's like a more realistic jump. And I think that what you said is so true. Like this framework helps give you the permission that you need to validate those things that you gravitate toward and make them something a little bit more well-defined, and maybe something that you do for a living, or maybe something that you're just here to do as a passion.
And even if it's the thing that you do on the side or on the weekends, simply knowing that this is actually something that matters to you, it can kind of flip the switch and make you move from a place of saying, oh, I'm wasting my time, or feeling a sense of shame around it, which very often never should have been installed in the first place, to something that says, no, this is a part of me. And when I express it, even a little bit, even here or there, I feel better. I feel more like myself. I feel like I'm coming home when I get to actually be this way in the world. And even if it's not the way I earn my living, simply knowing that it's okay for me to spend some of my time and energy doing this thing, it really changes everything.
Awesome. Okay, so why don't we jump into the 10 different Sparketypes? I have them listed here. The first one is, I don't know if this is the right order, but I have the maker. What is the maker?
I'll dive into that. Let me share sort of like a one more sort of meta frame for these 10 before I dive in, because I think it kind of makes sense to talk about them in a specific order. And we'll start out with the maker because that's great. So of the 10, the way that I list them out, and it starts with the maker and it goes through to the final one, is in the order of how they provide fulfillment. In the ones that we're talking about, if you think about it like, on a spectrum from left to right, the maker, which we're starting out with, the ones that we start out with on the left side or on the first part, they're the ones where your sense of fulfillment from these things happens mostly internally. The net product or the outcome of your efforts may affect a lot of people. It may change the world, but it's just the effort that you put into doing it that makes you satisfied, that gives you what you need. And on the other end of the spectrum, once we start talking about further down, the fulfillment becomes much more external. So it's much more about the effect that you're having on other people. And I think it's important to note that because a lot of the conversation around what you should be doing to live a meaningful life and to get what you need all focuses around the fact that you can't actually, it's not valid. It's not meaningful unless you are entirely in service of other people. And what we see is, yes, that makes a difference. Everybody feels better when we're doing something that helps other people. But there are also certain drivers where a lot of what you do may affect a lot of people. But even if it doesn't, just your ability to spend your energies doing that in the world gives you almost everything you need to be deeply gratified by what you're doing. And that allows us to drop into the first one because the maker is one of the purest examples of that. So the maker is the first of the 10 Sparketypes. The work of the maker is fundamentally to make ideas manifest. It is the creative drive. So I'm a maker. That is my primary Sparketype. I wake up in the morning and I look around and I'm like, what am I going to create today? And what's funny is that if you're a maker, then you probably listen to me and you're like, well, yeah, but dude, everybody's like that. Because whatever your orientation is, whatever your Sparketype is, we tend to see the world that way, and we believe everyone else does too. We can't conceive of the fact that somebody else doesn't have the same drive, and yet they don't. So for me, I walk down the street and I see ideas in search of being made manifest. And I'm like, my big work is to say no to the vast majority of them so I can say yes to a few that allow me to go deep into them. So in the maker, for me, it's all about creation. This manifests from the time you're really, really little. So I was the kid who, when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, I would convince my folks to drive me in like the big beat up Chevy Blazer down to I lived in a town where we actually had like a traditional, like the town dump. And we'd drive down there, we'd open up the back gate, and I would find parts of old bicycles and throw them in the back. We'd bring them home and I would duct tape them together to create these Frankenbikes. And I was just constantly making things from the time I was little. That has changed as I've gotten older. But, it's changed because now I write books, I create experiences, I build companies, I create media. But fundamentally, the thing that gets me up in the morning is the potential to make something from nothing. So that is the core drive of the maker.
Got it. And so the other framework that you mentioned before we started this was like it's the internal and the external motivation essentially for these different Sparketypes.
So it's less the motivation, it's what makes you satisfied.
What makes you satisfied? Okay.
Yeah. So it's the other side of the equation. It's what gives you fulfillment. It's like, so for me, the thing that makes me feel good is the process of creation. So I may write a book that goes out and is helpful for tens of thousands of people. I may create a building or a work of art that in some way moves a lot of other people. I love the fact that it interacts with other people and makes a difference for them. At the end of the day, the deeper driver for me was the opportunity to actually create the thing. So yes, it definitely matters. I love the fact that what I create goes out and moves people, that it matters. For me, even if it didn't, I would still be driven to create. And as long as I can involve myself in the process of creation, that is the larger source of fulfillment for me.
On this show, I often focus on the mental and emotional aspects of living well, But physical health is just as important. You can't think, grow, or prosper to the fullest unless you have your health in check. Four Sigmatic products have really helped me with this part of my life. There are very few companies whose products I recommend without reservation, but Four Sigmatic is definitely one of them. I've been using their superfood supplements for years, long before they became a sponsor of this podcast. Four Sigmatic specializes in mushroom-based drinks that promote immunity, energy, longevity, and just help us live all-around healthier lives. As far as what I'd recommend, they make a wide variety of different blends, but there's two that I'll recommend to you. The first is their Coffee with Cordyceps blend. Cordyceps is a medicinal mushroom, and it's been shown to support energy, stamina, and athletic performance, so it's perfect before a workout or during a study session or any time you need some extra focus. And all their coffee is 100% organic, and it actually tastes like coffee, not like mushrooms in case you were worried. The second product I'll recommend is probably my favorite supplement I've taken in a very long time. It's not a coffee blend, it's actually a blend of 10 different adaptogenic herbs. What are adaptogenic herbs? In a nutshell, they are plants that have been traditionally consumed, often for thousands of years, to help people adapt to various forms of stress. They help minimize fatigue, promote focus, and just increase general well-being. So I've been mixing this blend into my morning smoothies for a while now, and I've been amazed by how balanced it makes me feel. Cognitively, I'm sharper, I can work for longer periods of time, and I just generally have more energy. As a listener of the Think Grow podcast, you can get 15% off any Four Sigmatic purchase by going to foursigmatic.com/TGP. They've also been kind enough to set up a discount code for you guys. So just type in the letters TGP, as in Think Grow Prosper, at checkout, and you'll get 15% off your order. So again, that URL you want to visit for the discount is foursigmatic.com, all spelled out, /TGP. Or just use discount code TGP at checkout to get 15% off your order. And now, back to the show. Okay, so we'll just move on to the second one because I want to make sure we cover all of them. Then we can kind of play around and see how they all fit together.
Yeah, we could do like an hour on each one of these. Or
I know. They're so interesting. Okay, next one. What's the next one? Is it the scientist?
Yep. Next up is the scientist. The work of the scientist is the compulsion to figure the thing out. It's the person who has like a complex problem that they want to solve, the puzzle master. It's the fact that you actually are solving a problem that may lead to a profound answer on a societal level, that may create new code that changes the nature of technology, that may cure a life-changing disease. You love the fact that that can be the net outcome. But when you're really being honest, the scientist involves themselves in the search for an answer simply for the joy of being involved in the search for an answer. It's what legendary physics professor Richard Feynman called the kick of figuring the thing out. You know, when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in physics, he kind of scoffed at it and said, you know, like, this is just a piece of metal. You know, like, this didn't matter. Like, my reward is the kick in finding the thing out. It was the search for truth. It was investing yourself in trying to figure out the answer to something that really mattered. Turns out the answer can change a lot of people's lives, but for the scientist, it's the pursuit of the answer or the solution to the problem that is the core driver.
Is it the first five that are more the core driver is the intrinsic driver? Is it the first five of them?
It's the first four are heavily, and then once we get into the fifth, then we start to go more external.
And the scientist doesn't need to literally be a scientist. It could, that's just the archetype name. It could be anybody who is just focused on finding solutions to problems.
Yeah, I mean, the scientist could be any, and that's the beautiful thing. All 10 Sparketypes can be expressed in nearly any job, nearly any field in a nuanced way. You know, you could be a lawyer, but the thing that you love about law is finding the answer to this really complex legal problem. Whereas a different part of what you like about law might be creating a new paradigm, for something. Another person they may love to be at trial, and so it's all. And that's the whole idea. And this is what you brought up earlier is you're not bound to a specific job or career. These things can be all expressed almost anywhere.
I love that. Okay. Next Sparketype.
So next up is the Maven. This is all about learning. So the work of the Maven is knowledge acquisition. You wake up in the morning and you're driven by a ferocious desire to learn more. This can and very often does manifest itself in one of two or sometimes both ways. Sometimes you become ferociously fascinated by one particular field or domain or topic or area of knowledge. Sometimes it's much more generalized and you just walk through the day and you're deeply fascinated by everything and you just want to learn all about it. If you could literally move through life just in a process of learning, if you could be a perpetual student and somehow figure out a way to sustain yourself, you would do that. And in fact, some people do that. Some people become that person where you get to spend your life researching, learning, becoming an expert on a topic. And the way that they may actually then interpret or translate that into a career or job is by somehow then transmitting, sharing what they know, or the advising side. But the thing that really drives them is they're essentially buying themselves the ability to spend a massive amount of time learning. So an example, I have a friend of mine who's an author. And before I had written my first book, I asked her, I said, why do you do this? Because it takes you a couple of years to research and write a book. And that's a lot of time. And you can't justify it because of the money that you make as an author. And she said, well, here's my approach. I find a topic that I'm deeply fascinated by that would take me potentially a year or two to study. And instead of paying to go to a university and learn everything I can about it, I convince a publisher to pay me to spend that same amount of time doing all the research to learn what I want to learn anyway. And then as a side product, because I then have to somehow, make a living doing this, I write up what I figured out and I put that out as a book.
I love that. And this is my Sparketype. I took the whole thing.
I could totally see that. Yeah.
And so, I relate to that a lot. I think that manifests in my life pretty clearly. I am constantly learning and constantly seeking out new ideas and wondering about how the dynamics of certain things. And so I spend a lot of my time learning, and I feel a bit of guilt sometimes, to be honest with you, because it's often not directed to any particular end. And this has been kind of a source of stress for me because, I think the issue is you have to, with any of these Sparketypes, probably, it's like you have to learn how to, eat and also exist in the world and also show, let these traits be expressed fully. So I think that it's kind of an ongoing thing. But what I realized is that, for instance, on this podcast, some of my favorite conversations are with academics, had cognitive scientists on and this also had this psychologist on, Dr. Ruben Nyman, talking about sleep and dreams. And these have been some of my most favorite, my favorite conversations, just to ask these academics, these really intellectual guys about deep diving into certain topics. These episodes have been mostly for my curiosity, but it turns out they've been the most popular episodes also. So it's that's kind of cool. That's a fun place where it overlaps, And so that was heartening for me to realize that, the things, when I lean into my Mavenness, I get rewarded for that.
Yeah. And you kind of keyed in on something, which is, so Mavens are amongst the largest representation of any Sparketype in the general population. There are a lot of people who just love learning. And we see this also because there are a lot of people who are on a perpetual degree or certification path. Now, sometimes that's just because you're terrified of being in the real world, but sometimes it's just because you just want to keep learning. And then what a lot of Mavens realize is, at some point you have to make a choice. You have to figure out either, you're just astonishingly wealthy and you can spend your time doing that, or you have to figure out if you want this to be a part of the way that you earn your living. You may find out, okay, so I'm going to spend 75% of my time becoming absolutely the expert in this one thing that fascinates me. And then with some of the other time, I'm going to turn around and figure out a way to share this, to share either my experience of discovery or a distillation of what I already know is in teaching or advising or creating things. And that becomes the way that it attaches to becoming a part of your vocation or your living. And you sort of strike this really interesting balance where you're like, yeah, like if I buy myself the ability to spend 75% of my time just going deep into knowledge acquisition, I'm good then spending, like a bit more time figuring out how to translate my wisdom to value for other people so that it pays me to essentially spend the majority of my time in my Maven cave.
Nice. That's a good balance. Let's see. Next Sparketype. Which one is that?
So we have the Essentialist next. Now, the Essentialist is about creating order from chaos. This is about somebody, the work of the Essentialist is distillation. It's about looking at messy, complex things and figuring out how to simplify them, how to create systems, process, order. For somebody who is not an Essentialist, you probably don't believe that this person exists, because if you're not an Essentialist, very often you experience that type of work as the last thing in the world you would ever want to do. I am raising my hand there, by the way. The Essentialist wakes up in the morning and they are the most excited person to doing it. So the head of ops for a company is an Essentialist, which is perfect because she's the one who manages all the process management, the project management, the production schedules, and all these different things. And amazing as it is, where this is the last thing in the world that I want to do, she loves it. Like she loves the sort of like the ability to create all of this order and systems and process. The Essentialist also is one of the things that tends to show up in a very observable way early in life. So this same person, for example, would organize her stuffed animals according to height and color as a young child. That person does exist, and they tend to know it very early in life. That person also sometimes can end up in social conflict with others who don't operate that way, because while you're on a perpetual quest for order and simplicity, if those around you are not, it can actually become pretty grating.
I can see that. It's like Monica on Friends. She's probably an Essentialist because she's very orderly. She wants things a certain way, and if the living room is set up in a different way than she set it up, it causes some friction.
Yep, exactly.
That'd be a fun thing to kind of think about, is like an example, like a famous figure example of each of these Sparketypes. Have you already done that?
I haven't, actually. A bunch of people have asked me to do that, so I think I'm going to have to do it now.
Okay, so you can use Monica as the Essentialist. I give you my permission.
All right, we got that checked. Yeah, next up we have the Performer. And this is an interesting one. The Performer actually is the one that shows up the least often in the general population. The Performer is all about, now you would think on the surface, well, that means somebody who's an actor or a singer or a dancer. They just need to be in front of a camera. And not infrequently, performers are driven to those types of careers. But fundamentally, the driver underneath that is they're driven to take a moment or an experience or an idea and illuminate it and animate it in a way where the power of it becomes enlivened, where people get it and are moved by it and understand it on a more visceral, embodied level. So that can happen in the performing arts. That can also happen if you're attending bar. That can happen if you're making a presentation in a boardroom. That can happen, in a conversation with somebody where, you're just trying to persuade them about an idea. It can happen, it's like we were talking about. These things can manifest in nearly any different setting. We see the performer actually in business as potentially playing really interesting roles in any sort of presentation or business development, or anywhere where an idea has to be conveyed in a way where it's really beautifully illuminated, dramatized, animated, so that people really get it. This can show up in really powerful ways. And what we know is that something like 3 to 4% of the population are performers. So it is the smallest, the lowest representation of all the Sparketypes from what we've seen so far in the general public.
That's interesting. I was thinking about another framework, Gretchen Rubins' 4 tendencies, and I'm a questioner in her framework, and that's the most common tendency. And then I'm the most common tendency in this one also, the Maven. Like, am I just a basic guy? What does that say about me,
That means that you love to learn and explore and ask questions, which is valid for you. I'm a questioner too, by the way. And Gretchen's an old friend. I didn't believe it when I got the answer, and then she asked me, she said, "How many times did you take the assessment?" I said twice. She's like, "Do I need to say more?"
Yeah, self validating.
Yeah,
You want to make sure.
pretty much.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, no, I was just commenting on that because it's like sometimes you want to you want to be in the minority of, you want to I'm in the minority of personality types or whatever, but it's like it's kind of arbitrary.
So we're about to do a whole bunch of sort of phase 2 research on this because we're starting to see some interesting patterns, more nuanced patterns pop up in the data as sort of the group of assessment takers gets large. I have a hunch that actually one of the reasons that we see a smaller representation of performers may not be. I'm questioning that, to be honest with you. I still think it is the smallest one. I have a hunch that the performers tend to hide more often than most of the other Sparketypes. And so the assessment was designed to try and elicit that even when you're hiding. But my sense is that the performer very often, if it's associated with the performing arts, there's also often an association in families that, well, you'll never earn a living in that field. So that's not an okay way to be. And so we're kind of told that that's invalid. And it stops us, even though we kind of know that to be true. And even though deep down, that's really, the work that we're here to do. We're told, we're given signals by families and society that that may not be the way to be if you want to be a mature, responsible grown up. So we bury it. The other thing that sometimes the baggage that can be associated with the performer's archetype is what Aussies would call tall poppy syndrome, which is, oh, you shouldn't be that person who's out front. Who's being dramatic or theatric or really demonstrating this or gaining any attention at all. That's not socially appropriate. So I think the what we've seen is my hunch is that the performer potentially has a higher level of familial and societal baggage attached to it, and that makes people potentially resist expressing that part of themselves a little bit more than some of the other ones, where there tends to be a more sort of like linear acceptable societal outlet for them.
That makes sense. That it's there are certain ones that are a little bit more culturally off limits, let's say, and so that's good to recognize at least, because you can, well, then you can address it at that point if you recognized it. So
Yeah,
that's useful to point out.
in fact, I know we have to get through the others, but one quick story. So in the early beta testing of this, I was observing the data on sort of in the back end of our systems pretty closely, and I saw that somebody who I know completed the assessment, and it assigned this person as a performer. I did not.
You're spying on our results?
Maybe.
Just
big picture stuff.
Okay.
But this was the real early days where we were like in small beta, and I kind of knew all the groups of people who were going through. And I was like, I didn't think that was what this person was based on who I knew them to be. And granted, I didn't know them well at all. So I reached out and I said, hey, listen, we're sort of like reviewing things because we're tuning the algorithm to make sure this is accurate. And we pulled this result out. Is this wrong? Like, is this off? Do we need to revisit the algorithm, or did this detect something new that I'm not aware of? And she's like, no, this was spot on. In fact, this is who I've been since I was a little kid, but I've literally repressed it for exactly the reasons that we just talked about. And in the middle years now, it was like starting to bubble up. And she's like, I'm trying to figure out how to get this out now and lead more with it because I can't not do it anymore. So I was like, this is really fascinating.
That's powerful.
Yeah, so let's roll into the back five here. So next up, and we're starting to get more externally fulfilled, by the way, right? Because now we're interacting. A lot of the fulfillment starts to come more through interaction with others. So the warrior is next, and the work of the warrior is to lead, to organize and lead. This is all about seeing an individual or a group of people who are at point A, and they want to get to point B, and you're the person who participates in it. Very often you are one of them, by the way. You're part of this group, and you step up and you play the role of leading and organizing. The warrior also is one of these things that tends to show up in a very observable way very early in life. So if, you were all 6 years old and you're hanging out around the neighborhood, and you were the kid where every day you're like, all right, guys, come together. We're all going to play this game. Everybody, you're on this team, you're on this team, you're on this team. Let's go. This tends to be wired in, and it tends to show up in a very, very forward-facing, observable way. One of the big mythologies is that to be a warrior, to be that leader, you have to take on a very harsh or a very masculine energy to do that. And that is anything but true. That's sort of an unfortunate societal overlay about the role of a leader or a warrior. In fact, you can have a beautiful blend of masculine, feminine energy, and approach it in very kind, in gentle, in nuanced, and sensitive ways, and be an astonishingly compelling and accomplished and good and effective leader and warrior.
Yeah, well, according to Susan Cain's book, Quiet, it may even be more effective to be that way as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So from there, we segue into the next Sparketype, which is the sage. So the sage this is all about teaching. This is about, so the same way that the Maven is about knowledge acquisition, the sage is about knowledge transmission. This is about taking an idea or body of knowledge and conveying it in a way where other people just get it. It is about the effect that you're having on other people when you take what you know and you share it with them and they get it. A lot of people with this orientation will enter the teaching professions, but again, they don't have to. This is an incredibly compelling thing as a parent. This is a compelling thing in a boardroom. This is a compelling thing as a therapist. The title really becomes irrelevant. It's the ability to take something that you know, that you've embodied, that you have figured out, and then turn around and transmit it in a way where it lands and becomes embodied and understood in other people, very often in groups of people.
So this is my shadow Sparketype.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
This is my secondary Sparketype, which, yeah, I mean, I thought so too, because that's how Think Grow Prosper started. It was basically
right. That's what you do.
Yeah, exactly. It's perfect. So right. So if we look at my primary Sparketype, which is the Maven, the learner, and then my secondary, the Sage, which is the teacher, it explains perfectly my path so far, right? Because I started Think Grow Prosper as an Instagram account, right, back in 2014, and it was because I wanted to learn for myself, like certain principles that I felt would help me, and that I wanted to remember these principles and ideas and concepts that I felt were useful and it could get me through this hard time that I was going through, right? And so it was all about learning for me, and it was all about documentation for me. And so I documented it on this Instagram page, and I made these quotes, and then the secondary benefit of that was that I was teaching other people about these concepts, and it really was secondary in the sense that, like, I didn't care that much. I wasn't using Instagram in the traditional way. I was using it as because I didn't know of an app that I could just upload quote graphics to and look at them for myself. So I did it on Instagram, but it happened that my Sage came through, and I was I was also teaching other people, and then I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and I still enjoy that aspect of it. But that's why I have this podcast. That's why I write blogs and everything. And so I think that's so. When I realized that, I was like, oh damn, Jonathan, you're onto something, dude.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I mean, the way you describe it, and very often, like, you're sort of seeing, sometimes it is the primary Sparketype that you can potentially turn into a living, but sometimes it's actually the secondary that becomes the way where you find a way, if at all, to like actually make this a thing that generates your source of income in the world. But you kind of figured out that 80-20 way to make it work and enjoy yourself at the same time.
Love it. Okay, what's the next one?
So we move in on to the final three here. The next one is the advocate. So the advocate is all about, the work of the advocate is giving voice to the voiceless. This is about the person who feels compelled to stand up for something or someone. Now, this is interesting because very often what we think about is, people or communities of people who are voiceless. Like, this is the activist. This is the person who sees somebody who's being underrepresented or ignored or disempowered or disenfranchised. And they feel in, like, on a DNA level, this is not just, this is not fair. My job is to stand up, is to actually give them voice, is to be the person who can help them. And I'm compelled to do this. And a lot of people find themselves actually expressing their role or their drive as an advocate by becoming some form of activist or by starting a company that serves the purpose of creating a conduit or channel to give people without power a voice. But it's not limited to people, right? The advocate can also be a voice for beings, for environments. So it could be animals in need. It could be nature. It could be forest. You can also be the advocate for ideas. So you may see profound ideas that are being ignored, left behind, that you know need to be seen and heard because they can make a really big difference. And nobody's willing to step up, and you become the champion for an idea. And again, maybe that's forward facing as an activist in the world. Maybe you're in a team, in a company, and you become the advocate, the champion for a particular idea that nobody else is willing to actually give power to. So this shows up in a lot of different ways.
That's awesome. Okay, cool. So next one.
The next one is the advisor. And the advisor, the work of the advisor is to guide or to mentor or to coach. Similar to a sage in certain ways and similar to a warrior in certain ways, but different because unlike a warrior where it's all about leading from within, the advisor essentially stands on the outside and takes a person or a group of people or an organization and they advise them, they give them input, they coach them, they're guiding them from the outside. They're walking alongside them and sharing their wisdom on process. It's basically somebody wants to go from here to there, and you are the one who advises, coaches, and mentors along the way from the outside looking in. This shows up very often in the world as literally under the titles of advisor or mentor or coach, things like that. But again, it doesn't have to be, right? This can be almost any different person, any different role. This also, the advisor is interesting because there's a fairly high level of intimacy in the relationships. That's one of the things that becomes so satisfying with it, and very often over an extended period of time. So the advisor is about guiding somebody to a desired end over a window of time and developing that trusting relationship over time. That's where so much of the fulfillment and the meaning comes from for the advisor.
So what would you say is, because I'm trying to draw a really hard distinction in my mind between the sage and the advisor. What would be the defining difference between the two?
It's a great question. Two things. One is very often it's a matter of scale. And then the other is the sage is more about transmitting knowledge or information or wisdom, regardless of whether it's actually walking somebody over a window of time from point A to point B through a process, which is more the advisor.
Okay, so the advisor is a little bit more people oriented, or in the sense that they're working more intimately with someone and taking them rather than just downloading information.
And it's also more process driven. So you're sort of advising somebody on the input as they're like working towards something, whereas a teacher is much more about knowledge transfer. And that moves us to the final one, and this is the most sort of externally fulfilled one also, and that is the nurturer. So the work of the nurturer is to give care. This is the person who wakes up in the morning. Very often, they're a deeply empathic person. They feel other people's pain. They feel other people's suffering. Sometimes on a level that's actually difficult. Sometimes on a level that becomes paralyzing because they can't figure out how to become boundaried. And that, in fact, some of the work of the nurturer is to figure out, how do I take care of other people? How do I do the work that I'm here to do? How do I give care? How do I nurture others when I also feel their suffering and not end up having it destroy me? So part of the work of the nurturer is to do this thing they're here to do, and then at the same time, learn how to create boundaries and learn how to create self-care practices that allow them to sustain their own sort of sense of being okay while they give care to others.
So this is very compassionate people.
Yeah, very often.
Wow. Okay. So that is 10 different Sparketypes. So by listening to this, people might have already identified their own Sparketype. Is that possible to do without taking the assessment?
Yes. In fact, the first time I shared this ever was before the assessment was even public, and I shared it in a talk with a room full of people. And as it was the most incredible thing, because as I would talk about different things, a handful of times, different people in the room started crying, which took me by surprise. I was not ready for that at all. But it was simply that the description of what I was offering and the validation as this is actually a valid, true way to be in the world landed as so true to them that they're like, this is who I am. So yeah, and this is where this brings us full circle in the conversation, right? Which is that so many of us, we know this to be our truths. It's just beneath the surface, but for some reason, we just haven't stood in it. We haven't acknowledged it. We haven't validated its value in the way we invest ourselves in the world. So simply hearing these different things very often gives you a really strong clue. The reason we built the assessment is because we want to give you a higher level of certainty that this is actually more accurate. And also, as you sort of shared along the way, we wanted to tease out the fact that we all have a blend of these things, but as a general rule, two predominate, and one is sort of really takes the lead as the work you're here to do. We call that the primary. And then there's a second one, we call that the shadow. And it's not because it's a shadow and sort of a Jungian, like this is the dark side type of thing. It's that it lives in the shadow of the primary. It's something that you're good at. You probably enjoy doing, you're accomplished at. But if you're really being honest, you do it primarily in the name of being able to do the work of your primary better.
Like for me, the way that manifests, I think I don't know if I said this explicitly, but essentially my Sage activities pay for my Maven activities. So the fact that I am able to teach people and kind of parlay that into getting paid in different ways, that allows me to, like, that's my 9 to 5. Then I'm able to then go out and just learn about whatever the heck I want to learn.
They work very well together. I mean, especially when you understand, there's this interplay. It gives you a certain amount of freedom to start to run experiments to see how you can leverage them to really figure out the sweet spot between just doing the thing because it's the thing that you want to do versus like, can I actually build a living, or can I bring more of this to my job or my career, or allow it to inform my trajectory moving forward.
What's your shadow Sparketype? I don't know if I asked you that.
Yeah, scientist. So I'm a maker scientist, which is actually a pretty common pairing from what we're seeing. So I wake up in the morning, I love to make stuff. But at some point along the way in my process of creation, I always hit a wall where there's a problem that needs to be solved. There's like a complex puzzle that needs to be figured out. And when I hit that, I go into problem solving mode. I go into scientist mode. Like I put my white coat on. And then, but here's the clue, and here's the reinforcement that that's actually not my primary. As soon as I have figured out what I need to figure out to allow me to return to the process of making, I do. Whereas if I was a true scientist, if scientist was my primary, I would just stay in the question. I would look for more deeper, nuanced solutions because it was fun. Because I was just jonesing to go deeper into this problem and find more complexity and go deeper into and find a better solution. For me, because that's not my primary, it's just the thing that allows me to do my primary better. The second it gives me what I need, I go back to the work of my primary.
And okay, and so for people that want to be like absolutely sure of their Sparketype, where can they take the assessment?
Yeah, so you can take the assessment online. It's at sparketype.com, and that's just SPARKETYPE.com. It takes about 10 minutes-ish. I would tell you that it's 50 questions, but it's actually a little more involved in that. The assessment has been built with a dynamic algorithm that actually adjusts a bit as you go. And for some people, you may actually get a few more or a few less questions based on the answers that you've already provided. So it's sort of a dynamic algorithm behind the scenes. So, but the average person takes, I think it's about 10 minutes, 7 to 10 minutes or so to do it.
Yeah, I took like 10 minutes to do it. It was pretty simple.
Yeah, and the one thing I would just sort of recommend also, and we say this right at the beginning of the assessment, is sometimes we just want to rush through really fast just to get an answer. Or sometimes we want to answer the questions in a way that we, quote, think we should answer them, those generally always end up in a really unsatisfying outcome. Really just take your time, think it through, and nobody else is, this is just for you. And answer what your unique individual private truth is.
Also, make sure you're not hungry or irritable when you're taking it. Like, be in a good space, you know what I mean? Like, so that you can like take your time and like answer honestly. I think that's useful. It's a helpful. Your state of being is actually important when you take any personality assessment, I found.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, you want to be in a place where you feel like you're comfortable and you can sort of like give it what it needs. It's not. I mean, there are a lot of online quizzes that are like a handful of questions and like they tell you what your element is. This is not that. This is sort of it's a more involved process, and it'll ask more of you than that.
Okay, Jonathan. Something I want to do real quick before I let you go is I want to. I heard you talk about. Okay, well, we talked about this idea that these Sparketypes can be the traits that go into that make up any Sparketype can be expressed in a variety of different professions, in a variety of different ways, and so I was just hoping for you to kind of illustrate how that might work. I heard you talk about use the example of a doctor one time, and you kind of took the profession of doctor and ran through all of the different Sparketypes and showed how a doctor could be any of the Sparketypes, in fact, and illustrated how it might manifest within that profession in different ways. Can you take just a moment to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just run with that example because it's sort of an easy one to go with. So let's say, like somebody is in the profession of being a doctor or wants to be a doctor. Like, could you be any one of these things and be a doctor? And the answer is yes, just like pretty much any profession. So could you be a maker and be a doctor? Well, sure, in a number of different ways. For example, you might be a plastic surgeon. And the thing that draws you to plastic surgery is the process of creativity. Like you're the artist who's actually making something beautiful. That's the part of it that you really enjoy. Everything else is okay. The thing that keeps you doing it is that, or maybe you're somebody who actually loves to create equipment and things like that actually make a real difference. Maybe you're an orthopedic surgeon who's literally reconstructing parts of people's body, and it is the making process that completely lights you up. Maybe you're a doctor and the part of it is the scientist. Maybe you're the one where, like there's a problem that needs to be solved. There's a procedure that doesn't exist. There you have a patient that they clearly need something, but nobody's figured out how to fix them. You could be the diagnostician where the scientist says, okay, there are these 60 different symptoms that are presenting. And the thing that excites me more than anything else is figuring out the puzzle. How do these things go together in a way where it lets me know
This would be like House.
exactly this is House. Like that is like the scientist manifest as a doctor. The Maven is the person who actually would be at the table with House, who is sitting there when it's like, okay, so tell me like, who's the person who's encyclopedic on all of these different things and the possible things that it could be. So very often the scientist and the Maven, like the diagnostician and the person who's encyclopedic in knowledge pair really well together. But you may be the doctor who just loves to be the fount of information because then you can sit at that table and collaborate and figure out really complex, new, interesting, fascinating solutions. The essentialist, like on a procedural basis, maybe you're the person who looks at procedures in an OR, procedures in a hospital, and you see waste, you see inefficiency, you see risk, you see all sorts of tolerances that that create danger. And you love deconstructing those processes and figuring out better ones to create better outcomes. And that's part of what you love about that role. Performer is one where people are like, how could you actually be a performer? So in a lot of different ways, right? How many times does a doctor in a particular role have to sit across from somebody else, or whether it's a patient or a team, and explain things in a way where complex material becomes simple, clear, animated, demonstrative, where they get it, they can do something with it. This is a doctor who can actually send somebody home after a consult in a way where that patient remembers everything that was important, and they remember exactly what to do and why, because the doctor was able to tap that performer side of them to convey it in a way where they knew it would be so animated and alive that the person would get it.
Maybe an example of that would be Patch Adams, like Robin Williams' character, and he was a doctor that was entertaining. Yeah.
Exactly. And maybe that happens within a team. Maybe that happens in a teaching role also. If you are a doctor and you also train young docs and med students, the warrior again is the person who may lead teams. You may lead an operating team. You may lead a diagnostic team. You may lead a part of a hospital, or you may lead a practice. The sage is the person who knows something. They have the body of wisdom, and part of what lights them up is conveying knowledge to others. Like, this is probably the person who may love rounding with young students and teaching them what they know. And even though they love working with patients, the deeper part of what they really love is being the teacher to up and coming. You have the advocate, and we see this a lot in the field, right? Advocates for ideas. Very often, the things that change paradigms happen because someone within the field was willing to embrace and champion an idea, or a maverick, or a group of people who are not represented, who need attention because they need money allocated towards a solution for them. And yet still, we're in the same profession. The advisor, this is the classic country doc. The person who is with a family or a person or a patient very often over years and slowly, gently advises them through the process of building and maintaining health. And the nurturer is also the classic. This is a lot of the same work, but it's the person where the thing that drives you more than anything else is just giving care. This is the person with an extraordinary, loving, gentle, kind bedside manner. And what's powerful is we know that there's actually strong research in the world of medicine now that shows that simple shift in affect can have a profound difference on the outcome, on patient outcomes. So and you can pretty much deconstruct any profession, and you can see how, no matter how you're wired, you can find a home in that profession. It may require you to shift the way you're doing things or pick a subspecialty that really allows you to do that thing, but it gives you the freedom to not have to completely blow things up and change industries and say, okay, I just need to figure out how to let this part of myself out in the path that I've chosen. It's eye-opening, and it's also freedom-giving.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the whole thing is the fact that you can do that you can stay in the same. Nothing has to change except your perception of your gifts and your particular temperament. And so with that information, you can then proceed to make changes in whatever position you happen to find yourself. So I love that, man. This has been really illuminating, and I think a lot of people are going to find this really useful. I will put the link to take the quiz, the Sparketype quiz, in the show notes. Are there any other additional links or resources that you want me to direct people to?
No, I think that's a great starting place for everybody.
Awesome, man. Jonathan, this has been so fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, thanks for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes on my website at thinkgrowprosper.com/podcast. That's where I put all the links and resources mentioned in each episode. It's also where I put the outlines of topics covered, which is a really good way to refer back to episodes in the future. Lastly, if you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes with your biggest takeaway. I make it a point to read all the reviews. You can also screenshot this episode and share it to your social media along with something you learned or found interesting. And tag me in your post because I'd love to see what you found interesting. Say hi and thank you for your support.